what shifted for us was the picture of how water rights were, what kind of water rights were in play. Because November 1, you start to see it being largely the storage rights and lesser amounts of the direct diversion rights. We see a large shift on December 1 because there are a number of reservoir facilities that whose water rights will start in December 1. So that again is going to rejigger all of our calculations because that will mean a lot more demand on the storage side beginning on that date. And so that can affect, again, you know, what we see on the curtailment picture.
So does that mean, because you've been very clear in your notice to the water rights holders that while we're lifting temporarily, we're also gonna, they should watch the web because we're also gonna reimpose as we need to. Does that mean December 1st, it may well be that we have to recurtail in certain places because that demand curve changes, because the rights change?
They do change, and it really depends on which water right priorities are coming on board December 1st. So, you know, where they sit in the picture, because obviously if they were like state filed applications, those generally have 1927, 1929 type priorities. If one or a couple of large ones of those come into play, it makes a lot of difference in our calculations versus if it's storage facilities with like a 1958 priority. You know, it really shifts what we see. So it's always based on the direct modeling.
Of course, just when you think it can't get more complicated, it of course gets more complicated.
Yes, it certainly does.
Hey, one thing, I appreciate you mentioning the assistance from the other agencies. And I was wondering, when you said regional board assistance, did it include the North Coast region or was it just the Central Valley?
We had, John, did we have North Coast participation in the curtailment work?
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
to 5, and they were awesome.
Yeah.
Their inspectors, they did a lot of work for us. They were very awesome.
That's great. And I'm visiting with Region 1 tomorrow, so I just want to make sure if they did help, you know, I would thank them.
Absolutely.
But I think you have a crew of willing folks there too, you know, so as this goes on.
Well, you want to be able to tell them they're very awesome.
Yeah. They're already awesome.
I mean, my grandson would really like that one.
No, that's great. It's lovely to hear that. And thanks to the Department of Water Resources. Thanks.
And I just wanted to punch one point that was pretty much covered here, but this last release of curtailments of the pre-1954 in the Delta watershed, that really was very much demand-driven. And that's another instance where we're working closely with the department and the Bureau to make sure that by doing that, it's not having any negative effects in the Delta in terms of salinity control. And you'll be hearing more about that. And this is a good segue to the item 7 where we'll get that
Please.
full update.
Great.
So at
Why
this
don't you go
point,
ahead.
yeah, we could probably have everybody come up and do the item 7.
That'd be great.
So as requested at the first October board meeting, and also consistent with the board TUCP order for the Delta Operations State Water Project, Central Valley Project, the department and the Bureau are now providing monthly updates with regard to drought operations under the TUCP. But at that first October meeting, there was board members expressed desire to get a little bit larger update also from the fish agencies. So this is that combined presentation now,
Great.
the required monthly update by the department and the Bureau, which we will start with, and then the fishery update, including a fishery 101, and also the preliminary results, because it's not all yet in, but the results of biomonitoring and how we're doing as a response to the drought. So start with, we can do self-introductions, but we'll be starting with, to my left, John Lehigh, providing the DWR update.
Okay, thanks, Les. So we do have a presentation for the projects to start with.
Thank you.
And as Les noted, we have our fishery colleagues with us today who we have sandwiched between the two project agencies. Mr. Fujitani on the
fish
end there
sandwich
for the
is what
Central
you're
Valley
saying?
project. there's a separate, I think there's a separate presentation the fishery agencies will be making following this presentation for the projects.
Okay, great.
So again, John Lehi, DWR. What I'd like to cover as part of our update here is three main items. One is just to maybe in a little more detail go over the conserved water through the TUCP, over which Bay Delta standards were modified as part of that order, and where the conserved water resulted from. A touch also on the 2015 drought contingency plan. We've already submitted the first part of that, as you know, October 15th, and there's another plan required the January 15th. And we'll finish up with the hydrology and operations update. Let's see. I need, oh, Carl, could you hand me that? Thanks. Let's see here. Okay, there we go. So just a reminder that, so the Bay Delta standards, as we're all aware, this is our kind of our internal summary sheet that we put together that shows the various standards for the various purposes. And as you can see, marked in red, there were a number of standards that were affected by the TUCP over time. It's been modified quite a few times as we've stepped through the year. And these were all in efforts to conserve water, primarily upstream. So we were talking about, of course, the X2 standards, which is the habitat protection outflow, which is shown there under fish and wildlife protection, outflow standards during the summer, Rio Vista standard, which is currently in play, Vernalis flows, cross-channel gate was that initial modification, if you recall, back in February. And the primary one under water quality standards on the lower panel there for agriculture was the Western Interior Delta, which was the movement, if you recall, Edmonton standard moving to 3 Mile Slough. One thing to note here, and this will come into play when I talk about our October 15th submittal. Generally, the standards there aren't as many standards that would require additional releases in the fall. And so that, if you will, the bar is somewhat lower as far as standards that are required for the projects to meet. And that will come into play when I talk about our October 15th submittal, where we are not really asking for any additional modifications to the D1641 as it relates to the October through January period. So I'll touch on that a little bit in a couple slides here. But this is a bar chart showing the savings. So we've been reporting to you as per the TUCP on the conserved water as a result of these modified standards on a monthly basis. And so here's kind of a breakdown per month how that savings has taken place. If you look at the February-March period, even though there were potential for modifications, because we received the rain event there beginning of February, we actually didn't, we actually met the D1641 they were met just through the natural flows during those first couple months. So there was very little savings first couple months. Largest month with savings was actually April, and that was primarily through reduced outflow requirement in April, so that would have been the X2 requirement, essentially. So that was the biggest month for savings, a little bit of that in May as well. Into June, it was more a function of the outflow requirements in June, and we also started to see savings associated with the movement of the Edmonton requirement upstream to 3 Mile Slough, primarily in the June-July period. There were no standard, we met all the D1641 standards in August and September, with the exception of a minor, we didn't quite meet the August standard, if you recall, by about 22 CFS. We notified you that. We made up for, we had additional outflow the following month as a mitigation for that. So that was somewhat unrelated to the TUCP order. The October, we're still crunching the numbers on that. We have a report due to you this month. It looks like there will be some additional savings upstream associated with the Real Vista standard that occurred last month. And as we sit here today, all the standards are now once again being met due to the little bit of precip that we have seen in the system has been enough to now meet the Real Vista standard once again.
A question, this may
Yep.
be in your presentation, or maybe not, because you're talking about the TUCP as opposed to talking overall, but I realized at one of my speaking engagements last week, as somebody was from the agricultural community was making a point, the classic comment that water was wasted. And I was trying, there were a number of questions, and I realized that I couldn't do the same sort of numbers thing for the flex that the fish agencies found in the biological opinions, because I was trying to make a point of just how much I really felt that the agencies had stretched, both the projects and the fish agencies, to try and find some way of navigating through a very challenging period of time. So I don't know if you've done the math on that, and I guess this is just if you have, it would be, I'd like to have it. You don't have to do it here today, but it would be helpful to be able to articulate what the fish agencies did as well, as I can talk about what Tom did under his order.
I'm glad you asked that question. That would be helpful. And also, just to get a better handle on, I think the water wasted argument is the missed opportunity, you know, for not reacting quickly enough. And so I've always had a challenge. I know Mr. Loeffler and I had an exchange about this earlier this year. A couple of years ago, you know, the claim by many that was 800,000 acre feet lost, and it would just be nice to have a common understanding as to the facts that you're talking about, but then also if there was a missed opportunity because of not reacting quickly enough, what are we talking about? How much water?
Yes, so
If
that...
you can help us talk about that, that would be helpful.
Okay, yeah, and that's, I don't have that as part of this particular presentation, but, you know, maybe at a later date we can get more into those.
That'd be great.
So this is strictly just the board requirements, but as you've noted, there were also modifications associated with implementation of biological opinions. So, but the scope of this is just the D1641. So we did submit the October 15th drought contingency plan. This is just a subset of the standards that you had in the larger chart, and it's just for the next 4 months. It does. So what we did indicate in that October 15th plan is that we didn't see the need for any additional modifications from those modifications that had already been approved. So that those modifications were in red, and those the only ones still in effect for October, November, and actually through November 15th, to be more precise, were the Real Vista flow standards and the Vernalis standard. If you recall, there was some adjustment to that. Rather than making that a volume in October, it was spread out over a 31-day period within the October to November 15th period and at a somewhat reduced rate. So those were the two that were in effect for October and through November 15th. Now, at this time, looking forward, you know, we were asked to look at various hydrologies through January, and that include the 50%, 90%, 99%. Under those historical hydrologies, it didn't look as if there would be any issues in meeting the remainder of the D1641 standards through that time. Now, the picture could very well look a lot different if we look further into next year. It will certainly look different. But at least for the immediate future, we don't see issues with the D1641 requirements. Now, one thing we are discussing, though, is contingencies for dealing with maybe some of the implementation of the BIOPS once again, potentially associated with, for example, the cross-channel gate operation and which is required to be closed as of December 1st, which is different than D1641. Also, possibly, if we're so lucky, dealing with a first flush event this year, So we're also trying to work through some scenarios there where we could perhaps more effectively manage through that type of event as it relates to the biological opinions. So those are discussions that are occurring. As it relates to Z1641, we don't see the need for additional modifications, at least through the January 15th period. So we do have this January 15th continuation requirement for the drought contingency plan, which of course will look into all of water year 2015. And as I say, that's much bigger issues associated with that. Under the drier scenarios, what we're going to be looking closely at is there's a lot of considerations, and these were the same considerations as part of the 2014 drought operations plan that was produced back in April of that last year. And essentially, you can see the number of the items here that potentially we're looking at trade-offs among these under the very dry conditions where insufficient supplies to go around to meet all these beneficial uses.
It's going to be hard.
Is that?
It's going to be hard.
It's going to be hard.
The good news is you're doing it, or we're doing it, however you want to, the appropriate phrasing, early this time, and in this more transparent way, which we really appreciate, as opposed to where we were catching up with ourselves, admirably, I might say, but catching up with ourselves last year. This year we have a lot of experience, but also much less water and storage to start with, so it's going to be, hopefully it'll rain a lot.
Yep, absolutely agree. So I'll just shift gears now just a little bit, very quickly, through 2014 hydrology and just a look out in the near term as far as what we see.
Which one was that? I should know.
That was Folsom,
Folsom, that
back
would
in
be, I guess.
January. So where did runoff actually end up for Sacramento Valley? So you can see the estimated 2014 runoff, so not precipitation, but the resulting runoff from that precipitation, essentially the fourth driest on record, as you can see, getting near some of those more outlier years in 1977, 1924, I think 1931, I believe is the other one.
Oh, that's a new one.
And the San Joaquin runoff, even more dismal, second lowest runoff on record, only surpassed by 1977. So the current conditions, as you just noted, Chair Marcus, not good shape, worse shape actually as we sit here today going into this next year, understandably, than we were last year at this time. So major reservoirs are now, with Shasta and Oroville near a quarter of their capacity, Folsom just under 30%. You can see the other reservoirs there, current conditions. The precip totals. So if you just looked at the precip total for last year, you might not see how devastatingly dry it was. I mean, you can see in blue there we ended up with 31.3 inches. You can see on the right-hand side there, which was, a good chunk more than the 24 and 77, which were the driest on record for Northern California. But as I indicated on the actual runoff, which is the important parameter, it was very much closer to resembling a 77 type event as far as the actual runoff. And where we sit today is actually on there on the far left-hand side. The 4.3 inches was as of November 15th. And we're running slightly behind average to date. Of course, we're very early in the water year, as you can see. And really, the big months coming up, which would be the December, January, February. So those will really be the telling months, of course, as far as what kind of supply we're working with. I will note, we are running below average this year to date, just as a indicator of how devastatingly dry last year was. We received more precip through November 1st this year than we did all the way up until the end of January last year. So that's not an indication of how well we're doing this year, it's just how dismal it was last year.
Well, and Bill Crowell helped me understand these charts in terms of the jumps. That we actually get most of our precipitation in big jumps. And so we lack those huge jumps that may characterize a wet year, but we got little jumps later on that just took us up.
I got a question. It's kind of a big picture question, but I think you make the excellent point that folks need to understand about how runoff doesn't track right with rainfall, and maybe to explain that a little bit. And for this year, it's clear to me, and that antecedent conditions play a big role in that, in terms of water that's already kind of in the saturated soil layers, right? But do you think actually a depletion of groundwater resources statewide has played a role also in kind of this deconfiguration, a disconnection between rainfall and runoff?
Yes, I think absolutely that would have a factor. That would be a factor after this being the third dry year in a row. And that's one thing that, even though there's no clear signal as far as precip is concerned for the coming year, could go either way, equal chances. So that's all over the board. But what we do know is the precip that we do receive will not result in what would be a typical amount of runoff that you would expect from that amount of precip. So in other words, median or average type precip will not produce average runoff, something much drier than that. And that's because of the parched conditions in the watershed. Start with the soil moisture, but the groundwater lowering of that certainly will have impacts on lowering the accretions to accreting streams, and it will increase the depletions to depleting streams. So that certainly will have an impact to the runoff. Not to mention, smaller reservoirs upstream in the watersheds, their surface water has been depleted, and so those will be recovering first before you see any of that runoff making it further down into the watershed. So all of those factors together, will do exactly as you say. That's one reason there's better chance that dry conditions will continue as a result, even though the precip, there's no strong signal one way or the other as far as what we expect to see precip-wise, but we do know it will result in less runoff.
Yeah, so looking at this chart, to get an average year of precipitation, it's been decoupled from runoff. So really to get a blue level of runoff, we're going to have to see a lot higher curve for precipitation. And it just emphasizes the critical importance for conservation in all sectors in California.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
And here's just the San Joaquin. Generally, the San Joaquin, you look at the Sac Valley, San Joaquin is just that much worse. So it was drier last year, off to a drier start this year as well. So just finishing up here, just a couple slides on the near-term precip outlook. This forecast was put out a few days ago, but it's for the next week. Talks about normal conditions essentially for the next week or so. We have latest that I saw was about 1.5 inches the remainder of this week, and maybe another 1.5 inches next week for Northern California, which is more in line with normal conditions that we would expect for this time of year. If we receive that, we'll still be slightly behind average by the end of November as far as precip's concerned, but it will certainly take it. It's at least kind of maintained delta inflows. We have not seen, for example, in the Feather Basin, we have not seen really any substantial response whatsoever from the precip thus far. It will take a significant, much higher amount of precip before we start to see some kind of runoff response. And again, this is what I had mentioned. This is the 3-month outlook for November, December, January. I think they're about to put out a new one. This is dated October 16th. So usually the middle of the month they put out the updated. But as you can see here, equal chances for above or below normal for Northern California. They do indicate slightly better than average conditions for Southern California. But
Is that good for the Colorado, or is that too far south?
it looks like it splits the Colorado on that. Well, most of the Colorado looks to be in the equal chances area. There's the southern part of it. There's a little bit of good news there, I guess. And so that's all I had as far as update on operations. I don't know if Paul, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I thought I would go through a little more specifics on the operations at the Central Valley Project facilities. And I think one thing that the TUC also asked for is a report of actions that we've taken to reduce impacts to winter run salmon, so kind of a update on what's going on there. So basically, it's operations at each of our reservoirs and temperatures and what's going on at Shasta. So with that, starting at New Melones Reservoir, our storage right now is about 504,000 acre feet, and it's been running fairly flat for November anyway, so our release is roughly equaling our inflow right now, and our release is at 200 CFS. We did have a pulse flow on the Stanislaus from October 21st through the 10th, and that was per the National Marine Fisheries Service biological opinion. And along with the pulse flow, that was to also help achieve the Vanellis pulse flow requirement, the one that was modified from 1,000 CFS in October to 800 CFS for a 31-day period in October, November. Right now, if we use October 21st as the beginning of the 31-day pulse flow period, it looks like the average flow will be about maybe 950 CFS, maybe just slightly above 950 CFS. So we should end up above the 800 modified requirement that we had for Vanellis. At Folsom, our storage is 284,000 acre feet, and the release is 1,050. We are holding that flat right now and reduced it to about 900 CFS in December. I guess I did want to add, too, with our reservoir operations, kind of what we had outlined in the drought contingency plan. We're trying to get down to our minimum releases as quickly as we can. Most of our reservoirs are at the minimum release already, and then our plan would be to hold that minimum release through December and then evaluate conditions late December and January and adjust appropriately depending on the hydrology and fishery conditions. So back to Folsom, 1,050 release right now. The week of October 20th, we did start releasing from the low-level outlets at Folsom Dam. That's to get to the very coldest water in the reservoir, trying to cool the temperatures for the fall run Chinook salmon. And the temperatures there at Nimbus Dam right now are about 58.5 degrees, and it's cooling going downstream. It's about 57 degrees at Watt Avenue. It's not quite where we want it, but it's getting there. Shasta Reservoir storage last night was 1,054,000 acre feet. And Shasta was still losing a fair amount of water. We've lost 50,000 acre feet since November 1st, but it's slowing down now. Our release out of Keswick there from Shasta is 4,300 cubic feet per second. We're going to 4,100 CFS tonight. And that's one reservoir we're not yet at our minimum release. We would like to be at 3,250, so we're working down towards that flow rate, and we're cutting as quickly as we can, but between our cuts on the river, we're allowing some time there for the biologists to get down into the river, check out the condition of fish feed. I think they actually do some fish rescue there if they can, if they're able to. So we make a cut, let them go out and inspect things, and we're making a cut. We're coordinating that with the fishery guys. Temperature operations on the Sac River. Keswick is releasing 59-degree water yet. It's cooling down to about 58 at the Clear Creek compliance point. It's another case, ideally we'd like to be below 60, but it's getting there slowly, but we're working down that direction. Also on the Sacramento River, the diversions, I think as staff had noted earlier, the diversions along the Sacramento River have dropped off since the end of October. And right now, we are seeing actually a slight gain in Sac River flow between Keswick, downstream Wilkins Slough flow. So things are turning around for us and looking better.
Mm-hmm. And the temperature, has the weather helped?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Because it was way up there for a while. It was sort of like
We're
cooking the
really-
fish.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I said, we're really dependent on the weather right now. We've basically exhausted our cold water pool at Shasta. At Folsom, with a low-level release, we may have maybe another week there before we'll be out of cold water, and that'll start climbing up. So we're really dependent on the ambient temperatures now. Up to the Trinity Reservoir, we've really cut back diversions from the Trinity system to the Sac River Central Valley Basin. We're basically minimizing our diversions at this point. The storage at Trinity is about 554,000 acre-feet, so that's definitely a lot lower than we would like to see. Releases to the Trinity River are 300 CFS right now. Temperatures on the Trinity River, our release out of Lewiston is running about 54 degrees with 51 degrees at the North Fork compliance point. In the Delta, we're operating one small unit at Jones Pumping Plant. The cross-channel gates, Delta cross-channel gates are currently open. We did close the gates from November 2nd through November 2nd through November 7th in response to the monitoring that we had on the Sacramento River. There was a spike in the number of, I think, primarily winter-run salmon that were migrating downstream. So we closed the gates for 5 days. The numbers fell off fairly rapidly. I think most of that was in response to a smaller storm we had. Closed the gates, numbers fell off, and they were open again on November 7th. I guess just a note too, and since our last update for you, in October we did briefly close the cross-channel gates to help us meet the modified Rio Vista flow for October. So we did have a short closure then. And that's all I've got for the update.
Thank you. Great.
Before
Thank
we, before we turn it over to the fish agency, I just had a comment, or question perhaps for Paul and John, responding to your question and board member D'Adamo about the water being wasted. Right now, delta outflow for the last few days in response to the storm event is in the order of 5,500 CFS, and the standard is 3,500 CFS. Now, as well as other times through the year, we're not necessarily operating to standards, but we're meeting flows to maintain salinity control in the delta.
Right.
So that's one of the things also that we're going to be discussing now, this group after this meeting, in terms of, well, how do we present the information, what happened this year, and what lessons did we learn? But that's one of the things that we need to make clear, is that just because the water is going out, it's not being wasted, and how much was that?
I think that's an excellent point, Les, and I think people forget in the going to the simplistic fish versus farms, or pick your simplistic slogan, that flows do double duty or triple duty sometimes, and that people seem to forget the salinity control imperative. So
Yeah.
that's good that you're thinking about how to talk about it.
No, it's an important point, but it's also, you know, if it's in relation to precipitation events, there are natural signals that get sent to the estuarine ecosystem as well, you know, that
Right.
create more productivity. They
Understood.
select for native species and achieve multiple goals. So not just the importance of salinity control,
Right.
but a host of other benefits to the estuarine system.
So with that, I'm not sure who's taking the lead. Carl Wilcox, we have from CDFW, Mike Tchaikovsky from Fish and Wildlife Service, and Garwin Yep from NOAA Fisheries.
Let's get this on. Carl Wilcox with the California Department of Fish and Game. Chair Marcus, board members, it's a pleasure to be here and provide you this update. We'll be tag teaming this as we go through it, so I'll start and then turn it over to Mike Tchaikovsky from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then Garwin will pick, with the National Marine Fisheries Service, will pick up the salmon parts. We have quite a bit of information to impart today.
Great.
And look forward to your questions when we get through this.
Thank you. Sometimes I'm asking questions because I don't know the answer. Sometimes I'm asking questions to help
There we
you
go.
illuminate things for the people listening over the web or the people in back of the room who aren't the sort of smaller circle. So,
So this is just a summary of what we'll cover today. We're not going to go into in-depth about kind of the biological background necessarily, but I think that will emerge as we go through the presentation, and certainly are happy to elaborate if there needs to be elaboration. And we'll cover smelt first, and then a lot of the issues, particularly with salmon, relative to temperature management, flow management, cross-channel gates, and OMR and exports. For the smelt, we'll go through the survey data and kind of look at the progression, focusing on delta smelt through the spawning season, the rearing season, and into the what we've seen through the fall midwater trawl. And then Mike in particular will talk about the early warning work that the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Interagency Ecological Program conducted last year to assess the potential effects on delta smelt of the modifications and provide a mechanism over and above what has been used historically to assess risk to delta smelt. And then we'll talk a little bit about longfin smelt. For delta smelt, the peak spawning was in March through mid-May. So, you know, those are periods in which we saw modifications through the temporary urgency change petitions to operations, and those were periods in which, you know, under the biological opinions and our authorizations for longfin smelt under CISA, we were primarily concerned with the potential effects of increased entrainment in those, and this is where the early warning work that Mike will talk about occurred. And then longfin smelt, because they spawn earlier in January through March, weren't necessarily as at risk from some of the changes, and particularly one of the things I think that was protective for the smelts this year, at least from an entrainment perspective, were just the generally low levels of operations other than during pulse periods, and then the fact that to some degree we didn't see a lot of use in the central and south delta, and Mike will talk more about that as we go forward. So this is the delta smelt abundance based on the spring Kodiak trawl, and so this indicates that, you know, we did see kind of an uptick from 2013 from what we had, but also something that didn't compare well with what we saw in 2012, which was the benefit of the 2011 year. So we saw, you know, good conditions in 2012 that unfortunately didn't carry through because of drier conditions as 2012 continued, and then we didn't see the, you know, the rebound in 2013. And this is the 20 millimeter survey, so this is telling us about, you know, the Kodiak trawl, or the 20 millimeter survey basically is telling us what reproduction looks like. And so, as you can see, we had relatively higher production in 2013 compared to a dramatically lower production in 2014. So these are juvenile fish that are picked up as they're growing and can be captured. So it's a movement from the larval survey that tells us where they're spawning to where they're starting to rear. And then this is the fall midwater trawl, and this is the fall midwater trawl for the current year, September through October, and this shows both delta smelt and longfin smelt. Both are at historical lows, or contemporary with historical lows, and very much in line with what we've seen through the current century. I think one thing to point out as we've gone through the season and operations, we didn't see large amounts of salvage for either delta smelt or longfin smelt. There was some. And one of the concerns we have with longfin smelt particularly is, and we've seen it in the past, is when operations are, and not so much constrained by the drought, but are constrained by other aspects of the biological opinions, we may get spawning there. And the entrainment effect, you can't really tell entrainment until the fish get big enough to be salvaged. So they need to be 20 millimeters at least. But what we've seen in the past number of years is that while we don't see adult salvage, we do have spikes of larval salvage later in the year, and we're thinking that that's basically because the adults are able to come in and spawn, and because of the way operations are going, we have the they have the opportunity to grow up in the South Delta, and then finally make their way to the pumps where they can actually be salvaged, and you see that effect. I think there's been concern about that relative to the overall abundance, and from the department's perspective, while we've seen those spikes, we don't think at this point that the overall effect on the population is necessarily that great, well, even though we see that effect. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Carl, and good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. I'd like to apologize for this in advance, but because we've got this Frankenstein presentation where we're each taking a section, I'm going to backtrack over a few slides that Carl presented. It should be turned on. Oh, you really have to get close to this, don't you? Okay, I'd like to just back up a bit and add to some of the background that Carl provided regarding those previous slides, because I think it's helpful to understand where we are with regard to interpreting drought effects on delta smelt and longfin smelt.
I love bubble charts. Thank you.
Yeah, they can be very helpful.
We all have our favorites. I like bubble charts.
This slide relates more to what we observed as the management situation last year, and I'd like to get to that after I revisit a couple of those previous slides, if I can. So as Carl described this, the spring Kodiak trawl gives us adult abundance immediately prior to spawning, and the survey normally and historically has started in January. And what we observed over the last few years, in short, is that we had a big spike in 2012 these are pre-spawning adults. This is production from 2011, obviously, which is a big year. There was a lot of outflow. There were a lot of good ecological conditions for fish in 2011, and as a result, we saw a big spike in adult abundance immediately prior to spawning in water year 12. When you look at 2013 and 2014, what you see is that they're similar numbers. There probably are a few more fish in 2014 than there were in 2013 at this stage. Now, this is important when you make the transition to what we see with larvae, because as you'll see, 2013 had many more larvae than 2014. And taken together, those two slides suggest to us that the larval production was a lot better in 2013 per unit adult abundance than it was in 2014. So part of the explanation of what we're seeing in 2014 is likely that there was poorer reproduction or poorer early larval survival in 2014 than in the year before. And that really isn't all that surprising considering the dry conditions that existed. But it is a little surprising when you move forward that, as far as we can tell up to this point in the fall, subadult abundance, which is what the fall midwater trawl is attempting to measure, is similar to this date to what we observed last year. So we're still a couple of months short of a full survey on this gear. But it may be that over summer survival this past year was better than expected
Or better.
and possibly similar to what we saw in 2013. Again, it's really probably too early to tell, but a lot of people entered the fall expecting that we were going to get next to no fish in the fall mudwater trawl. So the fact that they're there is encouraging. There at all,
Okay.
yeah. And
Did that relate to
This is so hard.
Mr. Wilcox's point about just the character of the operations? Is there a hypothesis related to that there wasn't as much of a gradient toward the pumping areas?
most likely not.
Okay.
During the summer, there's the fish are fairly far away from the pumps, and
Good,
typically
thank-
we don't have any entrainment issues. So
Right. So that's not a
It's-
factor.
it
Okay.
probably not. It's probably habitat conditions, and I think that we're going to take some time sorting this out, and we need to see the rest of the survey, and we're going to need to see the spring Kodiak trawl survey this coming year in order to have a full picture of what's happened this past year. But
Yeah, so we're clear to the web and everything. The over summer survival, we're still figuring out the possible mechanisms, and they may be related to habitat.
yeah, that's right. And again, we are still early in the fall. This gear, despite the fact that it's historically been the one that we use to officially assess the abundance of delta smelt, has some shortcomings, and we're at this point, I think we're just encouraged that we're seeing fish that can be detected by the survey. So the slide we started off on, which is really this section of my section of this discussion, it relates to the spring Kodiak trawl survey for this past calendar year. So this is water year 14. It's the months of January, February, March, and I believe April. I can't read the dates on that, but this shows the distribution of adult delta smelt as measured by that survey this past year, and it's a very important slide from the point of view of explaining where we were with regard to water operations. So if you look at each of those months, what you will see is that most of the fish or all of the fish are on the Sacramento River side of the estuary. So we had I think we had one odd fish on the San Joaquin side in a couple of the surveys. But most of the fish are either in the lower Sacramento River, up in the Cache Slough area, or over in Sassoon Marsh.
Is that where they normally are?
That is where they often are in dry years. And in recent years, typically when early freshets come from the Sacramento River side, which they usually do, the fish tend to prefer that side of the estuary, and what we see is a distribution that's not too different from this one.
Okay.
So operationally, this is a good distribution for the fish, because it means they are typically far enough away from the pumps that operations are less likely to affect them unless OMR gets quite negative. And what we observed in 2014 was that we didn't see a lot of risk of entrainment at any point during the winter and spring seasons for delta smelt. And as a result, we didn't impose any actions for delta smelt this past year. And at the facilities, there was no salvage of adult delta smelt in water year 14. And there was only low salvage of larval smelt this past year. I think the total at the end of the year was about 8.5% of the incidental take limit. So smelt were really not an issue for operations this past year. A lot of that is really attributable to the geographic distribution of the fish. And as John Lehigh said when he was speaking, one of the things that's emerged as a major area of interest for us is the degree to which the distribution of smelt might be manageable early in the season by controlling OMR during early storms where high negative OMR might draw turbid water and delta smelt down into the central and south delta. As we saw in 2012 when this occurred, and as we've seen previously, when those events occur where smelt are drawn down in early storms into the central delta, they not only get entrained immediately, but they also tend to stay there, and then there's entrainment later of those adults and entrainment of larvae that are produced when those adults spawn. So as John said, we're working together to evaluate whether there are manageable scenarios where we could avoid getting smelt into the central and south delta, because as we saw last year, if they don't, we usually have fairly clear sailing from an entrainment point of view.
And did those management, those mechanisms early this spring, were they related to the TUCP
Well,
on OMR?
Well, the main issue this past year was with regard to these actions in smelt was that there weren't any big freshets at the right time. So we didn't have a first flush. There wasn't enough water for the projects to export to get OMR to a high negative value anyway. So
Okay.
just by happenstance, we were able to achieve this result this past year. We'll presumably be working on this more in the future and may have more to say down the road, but clearly in this discussion there are some circumstances where management may be possible and there are others where it clearly isn't possible. For example, if there is a first flush on the San Joaquin side, no management approach that I can imagine would help us avoid having that turbid plume of water pass by the facilities and up to the northern part of the estuary where the smelt are. So because this question is emerging as such a critical one, where the fish are and whether they're moving into the central and south delta, last year we piloted some early warning, what we called early warning sampling at Jersey Point. And the intent of that sampling was to pilot both a new approach to collecting the data and also to see whether we would be able to observe any wholesale movement of fish past Jersey Point, which last year we believed was a point they would have to pass if they wanted to get to the central and south delta. And the new approach that we took for sampling was to go out with the same gear that the spring Kodiak trawl uses, but instead of taking one sample at each station, which is what the Kodiak trawl survey, the normal survey does, we chose this one location and we took 15 consecutive samples at that one location. And there's some in the weeds detail about what we did because we divided up the channel into lanes. But the bottom line is we multiple hauled sampled at Jersey Point, and our aim in doing that was to determine whether we're able to detect delta smelt at lower densities than the regular trawl survey is able to do. And the results are a resounding yes. We observed no smelt in the spring Kodiak trawl survey at Jersey Point in 2014. But we almost always got at least one smelt per day, as this figure shows in our early warning sampling. And nothing happened last year, so there was no transient of moving fish for us to observe, but the results that we got last year have given us quite a bit of confidence that this approach is sensitive enough that we'll be able to detect motion of fish. So we're doing it again this year, and we're actually starting a lot earlier this year. We're starting in December rather than starting in February, and our intent is to have this real-time intensive multiple haul sampling in place both at Jersey Point and Prisoners Point, which is a little farther upstream, during the operation season where we are potentially going to have concerns about where the smelt are, and to use that real-time information alongside the real-time physical information that's being collected for flows and turbidity.
And that's to see if you actually could do something about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. So the intent here is